All right. All right, welcome. The discussion today is talking about using UIC groups and logical names to segregate client environments, if you will, on a singular system. And this is an outpouring of some work I did for a client a number of years ago. And the reasoning behind this was because we went into the original disk drives and they were just an absolute mess. There was literally thousands of directories for users on the disk. It was hard to keep them separate, and if you had to find something, it was just a royal pain. And as an offshoot of that, the installation of the particular software prior to this was, shall we say, less than trivial and very, very manual and prone to errors and mistakes. So as part of this effort to separate the clients, I also modified the installation procedure such that instead of a 3-day installation process for this particular application, it became a 45-minute effort with basically zero possibility of completely screwing it up because there was very little manual intervention. Repetitive manual intervention or manual application of continuous similar things, you're prone to make mistakes. So that the idea behind this is to eliminate that as well. Everybody here probably knows this, but I want to go through it to make sure we're all in the same sheet of music. What are logical names? Basically, it's just a singular name for an entity to make it easier, to give you one set or one level of separation from something that you don't want people necessarily to have control over. Most common use is disk and or file names. Okay, if you have a disk DUA0 and you don't want people to point to what you call it user disk, for example. That way, if DUA0 has a problem, you have to shove everything over to DUA1. The users don't care. It's still user disk to them, right? So there's an advantage to that. It keeps that one level of separation, and it gives the manager the ability to move things around. Logical names are contained within a series of logical name tables, and those, in order of translation, go in a certain particular order, and it's what I call the logical name tree. Process logical names come first. That's the first place you look for a translation. If it's not there, it's going to then search the job table, which is the next level up. If you have multiple processes, or if you do a spawn to create a sub-process, a direct spawn would be a sub-process of this one, and it would also copy the process table, but a common table amongst the two processes there would be the job table, because that's one level up. So think of it as either a root or a tree, and as we move down this one, everything here is common to the ones that are above it or below it, depending upon what your perspective is. The next level up from a job is people that have the same UIC group number, which would be the group tables. Next level up from there typically is your system, which means everybody across the whole system has the same access to those logical names. And again, I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but just to give you the right general concept. Yep.
Two things. Before the process table is the user. Is the user table that you can define /user that's good for the next execution.
That's a subcategory of the process table. I'm not going to get into
the other one is the cluster.
Again, that's above the system that I'm not getting to that level. But the /user option on a logical name just means it's temporary, but it's still within the process table.
It's about user process.
Sorry?
It's about user's process.
Right.
It is.
But it's the next execution.
It's just for the next execution only. It's still in the process table. It's just a temporary logical name that's only valid for one execution. You can look at them at the table structure, doing a show logical /table. You can create new tables with their own names, which may or may not have a particular value. And I'll get into that in a bit. And you can also provide a search list within a logical name. And there are certain values to that, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. Search lists, why are they useful? The most common area that I know of for search lists, and these are logical names that are at the same level as you. So typically a process, we'll consider within the process table now, is go back a few years when disks were small, because they're not quite as small nowadays, and it was not uncommon to run out of disk space on a disk. How do you fix it? You can delete files, but what if they're data files or log files or archive files that you still need access to? What do you do? What you can do as a very simple way is to create a logical name search list. By definition, when you do a translation for a write operation will try to put the file at the target of the first logical name in the list where it can. So therefore, if you have a series of archive data, the easiest way is to take, let's use an example. Let's call it A1. A1 points to a directory on a disk. That disk is full. You create A2 on another disk in another directory. And the specifics of that are irrelevant now. Change your overall logical name, which say is archive. You now define archive to be A2, comma, A1. What that is going to do is it will write a new file into whatever A2 is pointing to. If you do a read, it'll check A2 first, but if that file does not exist in A2, it'll then look within A1. So it allows you to provide archive files or to create, quote unquote, more space without having to delete or move or do anything else, just by the manipulation of the logical names. Does that make sense to everybody? That's the power that you have with logical names. It also allows you to, again, using the search list, it can be even a DECnet network reference to another machine that has the archive data on it if you want it to be. There's a lot of flexibility there. One of the things that came to be an advantage in this particular environment that I referred to earlier is a concept called concealed devices. Now, it's similar to the cluster roots that are existent within VMS. So when you boot a machine, there's a logical name called sys$sysroot, which will point you to a particular sysn number for the node of your cluster. Now, single systems, you still come up, in effect, you still have a single node cluster. It'll default to sys0. And if you look at the sysroot like this and you do a show log of it, what it'll be is the device colon, the root number with a dot at the end of it and a closed bracket. And if you define the logical name to be that with the dot, with the added specifics, which I realized I didn't put on this slide, / translation equals terminal, comma, concealed. And I have an example of this coming up. The user of that will reference that device just like they would a disk. And that becomes their disk. There is a root 0, which is the default, which is the bracket 6 zeros or 0, 0 for those of us that have been around longer than we like to admit in public. That will actually equate to whatever that root device is. So if you look at, for example, I'll stick with the VMS specific one, sys$sysroot colon open bracket 6 zeros close bracket. That will equate to that directory if you were to look at the device itself. But you will not see the sys0 within that name. You'll just see sysroot bracket 6 zeros close bracket. So it kind of moves you down one directory. Now, in the case here at this site, every client had a 3-letter mnemonic associated with them. So what we ended up doing was to create a series of devices. I use the word devices in quotes here, using the mnemonic underscore and a number. So if there were 6 devices, it'd be mnemonic _1 through mnemonic _6. Now, we did something we weren't supposed to, which was to put a $sign in the end of it, because that was supposed to be reserved for digital, but everybody ignored it, so we did it anyway. So the device or the root device for every client would be their mnemonic with a number, $sign, and it start at 0 and proceed down from there. That was one of the things that actually cleaned up the devices completely. So now instead of having literally thousands of directories for user accounts at the root directory of that disk, you now had basically one directory for every client and all of their client specific accounts, etc., were within that particular directory. So from a management standpoint, as a system administrator, it basically consolidated a client to one particular location. Just overall, in general, try not to specify specific devices if you can. It just handcuffs you, because if something happens, you need to change the device for whatever reason. Device fails, you add a device, you need more space, you want to move things over. As a system administrator, all I need to do is change the logical name, and the user never knows the difference.
You mean $1 DTA 45?
Yeah.
Never use those.
Don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
It's hard to even see those out loud.
Don't. Well, you can. It just can't do it quickly or accurately. Yes. Try to avoid that at all possible. And again, the main reason is that if for whatever reason you need to move something, you can't. Now, in this particular case here, there were two different variants of this application. The full-blown version, which it was a laboratory information system, so it would cover all activities at a hospital or a laboratory. And another version was just a blood bank software. The blood bank software was significantly smaller, didn't require as much in terms of setup or anything else, and it only had 3 drives associated with it. The full-blown setup had 6. Followed the exact same methodology. The only difference is the mnemonic would have _1, _2, and _3, versus the full-blown, which have 1 through 6. But the same mechanism was in place. And the whole idea was to be A, consistent, and B, allows you to move things around. It just makes, I think the bottom line here is that logical names makes your life a lot easier. Also, use labels that make sense. It drives me nuts when I go to a site, they say, okay, I got D1, D2, D3. Okay, well, what does that mean?
That's the alligator, and that's crocodile.
You know, I mean, without getting ridiculous, I've also been to some of the logical names are so darn long, it's ridiculous. And that's just kind of the other extreme. You want to make things make sense to you. So if you say, database, I've seen a lot of them say disk dollar database, for example. That might very well be the label of the disk, and that means that logical name is created for you on your behalf. But even so, it has some type of a descriptor, so you have an idea what's there. Disk dollar user is probably the most common one out there, which is great, but which user? And is there more than one? Who's on 1, who's on 2, who's on first, whatever. But again, you have the ability to make something meaningful and useful, and logical names allow you to do that. But I think the key here is that, honestly, and the most common one is when the disk fails, you can easily move things around and not have the application folks care. Now, I want to try to go through the example here just to give you an idea how these things can all work together, and see if somebody can catch the error I made on this slide too. The system was in the healthcare environment, which has certain requirements for keeping track of any changes made to the system for HIPAA reasons and regulatory reasons, which made coordination important, because you got to keep track and make sure there's no cross-pollination and any of that kind of stuff. At startup time, every single client had its own UIC group and its own mnemonic that were tied to each other. To keep stuff separate from the protection scheme standpoint at the group level. Nobody had role privilege, because you had to go through group or higher, so that the only access you had to data was based on your group access codes. Anybody see the error yet? No, huh? Okay.
I'm just looking at
0.
Oh yeah, there are octal numbers, so
Very
you can't
good.
have 8 and 9.
Which I realized right after I submitted the thing, I said, oh, I didn't do that right. I know what I had in concept, but it was wrong. This should have been 0 through 8, or 0 through 5. What I meant to be is 0 through 10 octal is what I meant, but I wrote it down wrong.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, that was not a requirement. That was just a standard. If you look at the group UICs as they're defined by VMS, the privileged ones, if you will, or the ones that were system level, were 0 through, I think it was 0 through 10.
Yeah.
But 0 through 10 octal, which is 0 through 8 in reality.
Sysmax.
Yeah.
There's a sysgen.
Correct.
And is it, yeah.
So-
system.
just to make things easier, what we did in order to keep track is every time you did anything on this box, it was recorded using the UIC of the current process that was doing the work, which is a HIPAA requirement. It would write down both the group and user member number for the account that was doing the change. And what we did for purposes of, again, of keeping track of it is the zero account. So the group number comma zero was the installation account, and the subsequent ones were the support folks. Each number was assigned to a particular support individual. So we would know not only the fact that it was done by a support individual, we know who. And that's important from a HIPAA standpoint, compliance standpoint. As I said, each client system had a 3-letter code associated with it. That was just arbitrary. That was decided by the client. That's the way they wanted to keep track of them. Fortunately, they had a significant number of clients, but they always found a way to not have them conflict, which was kind of cool. So they didn't have any problems with that. Each client had their own disks, and it was defined based on the logical names, and where they were on the physical box made no difference. Some physical boxes had 8 drives, physical drives in them. Others had much more, depending upon how many clients there were and how much space they needed. But as far as the client themselves was concerned, they either had 3 or they had 6. What was behind it, they never knew and honestly didn't care. This particular environment, and this is an important piece because this contributes to the security and prevents the cross-contamination here, is these users were restricted to captive accounts. So when they logged into a command procedure that allowed them to do X, Y, and Z, and they did not have access to DCL, so they couldn't, change anything or look anywhere else. So while the mechanism would work for any environment, it's not necessarily a security thing unless you prevent people from accessing DCL and doing some other stuff, which would allow them to poke around much more than an application would typically. So this is not intended to be a security discussion or a security thing. Indirectly, it is if you provide the captive account, because they can't break out to do anything else outside of the control of either a procedure or of the application. The nice part about it is, from an application standpoint now, the application references the same logical names across the board. And those are independent of anything having to do with that specific client. So this was a computer-aided laboratory. That's where the CAL came from. All of the images were in $exe. And $exe, as part of the startup, was given a particular location, and it was always there. $REFL, for example, was another one for reference data. Similar type of format, just to follow a convention here. And this is an example. So NAS_1 pointed to DKA1, NAS1 dot. So if I was to look at the root directory of DKA1, I'd have a series of files out there or directories out there. NAS1, it might be KSL2, it could be, PSY4, whatever. And things could move around based on how much space I had and where things had to be, just to give, possibly to potentially spread out some IO activity. Yes, sir.
I left my backpack here. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no problem.
What was you promised it to someone?
So once everything was actually up and running, all references from the application were strictly to those 3, and that's it. Okay, so there was no direct connection from the user's perspective or the application's perspective. There was no tie between this and DKA1. So I could move that all day long, and then they would never know or care. And that's really the advantage here. There was a lot of initially, as clients were added to these particular systems, there was a lot of movement because we tried to balance the IO activity across the drives. I mean, again, nowadays that's probably not quite so critical because the drives are going to blow the doors off of most of this stuff anyway. But back in the day with the spinning rust like this, you had to deal with stuff where you had to be careful that you didn't overtax one machine versus another. Common startup procedure for all at system startup was kind of interesting. 4 parameters defined to the startup procedure. So every single client used the exact same command procedure. The devices for each client were set up in a mount procedure. So those are already defined once the disks were defined or mounted. So that was outside of the startup procedure, but the startup procedure was provided that as input. So you had the client code, the UIC group that was designed for that particular client. This was done just to make my life easier because since this was done, a couple things. One was there were multiple versions of this particular application, and the location of the startup procedure for each application was in not quite the same location because they hadn't adhered to any particular standard prior to then, just to make installations more fun, I guess. I don't know. That was before I was there to try to fix this. So to make my life easy and not to go try to do more that I really need to, the ones that were already installed, I just moved a few things around, but kept everything else the same as far as I could. I just specified what the procedure was and where it was within the context of the application environment. That just made my life easier. You could only do one application version at a time. So by specifying it here, I could change the version, but I could only do it when I started up the application. There was a mechanism to shut the application down, so I could actually call the startup procedure by hand, not just in system boot, if I had to start up a different version, but that didn't happen very often. And the image prefix was there because you can't install more than one version of a piece of software that has the same name. It has to have a different name to be on the known file list. So what we did was we gave it an image prefix. So if the image is, say, web, let's give it a name, web, then the actual image was linked as, aweb.exe. It was a bit of a pain at some point to do this, but that was the only way we could get multiple versions or multiple copies of the same image to be able to be installed as known images. And that had to be done because each image was customized for each client. So while most of it was all common, some of it was unique to each client. So each client had their own executable unique to them, even though it had the same name. So that was just a little way to get around it. Like I said, each one was submitted at startup with to use UIC group number, (1). And it was submitted with that particular username, and off it would go. And because it was submitted with that username, that automatically allowed the group the group logical names to be populated directly because you're in that same group.
I thought 0 was the one that gave you group privilege.
No, 0 was the one for 0 was the install.
Oh, okay, yeah.
1 is the first quote unquote user.
Okay.
And we did that to prevent any issues, because a lot of times on install we did all kinds of testing, and it also put data into a test log, and ran into an issue because we got rid of one of the logs, and the regulation inspector came in and say, "Why'd you get rid of it?" All it had in it was our testing. It had nothing to do with the actual users. Well, you should have kept it. No, we're not keeping it. And it said we use a separate number for that. We use 0 for the installation. 0 doesn't exist except for doing the install and the verification that it is installed properly, and blah, blah, blah. He finally gave in. But if you never have to deal with federal inspectors for healthcare systems, you'll be very happy. Trust me, you'll be happier for it, because it's 9 times out of 10 you're dealing with people that have no idea what computers do, and it's a nightmare. I also, when I did this, again, this is in the days when alphas weren't as fast as they are today, and systems in general weren't that fast. I got in there and found that in one particular case, it was taking almost an hour for the system to come up all the way. And I could never figure out why. Well, I did figure out why. they had some things that were trying to start up at the same time, and they just kind of beat the heck at each other. They wanted to do them in sync, one right after another, and nobody understood the synchronized command in DCL. So they just said, oh, well, I know it'll be done in 5 minutes. So if the startup took all about 2 seconds, they'd sit there twiddling their thumbs for 5 minutes and start up waiting for the timer to fall off before they go to the next one.
But use the serial queue, queue with a job limit of 1, submit everything to the,
But-
and then they'll run as soon as the other one's finished.
You're
I'm being logical.
injecting logic into this mess. You got on it.
Appreciate it, Fire.
By the time I got involved with this, it was multiple years after they started this mess, and it was just an absolute nightmare. It was a case of people knew how to spell VMS and not much more, and thought they knew what they were doing and really didn't. It was an absolute nightmare when I got in there. It took me probably close to a year to get it all straightened out. Boot times went from sometimes up to an hour down to a couple of minutes by the time I got done. It was just, and I mean, they didn't do anything wrong necessarily, but they didn't do anything necessarily efficiently either. But, you know, again, it's all experiences and knowing how the systems work that can find this kind of stuff. But it was fun. So this is what the submit looks like. And if I can do this, so that was the starter account, and Cal Dollar Start or Cal Start underscore KSL was the particular name we gave to the batch job so we could track it if we had to. That's the particular startup procedure. And believe it or not, we had a just for consistency and to confuse people, there was a group logical name called SYS Dollar Startup, just to confuse people. I did that on purpose because it gave them, it made them feel good because they were doing stuff at the system level, even though they weren't really. So it was one of those in every group, which was fun. And that's the actual version number, is 080. So part of it here is that's the group number, and it seems odd that it has the leading zeros in it, but unfortunately, the group logical name table actually has that specified in that way. So it was just easier to just pass that. It would get just for consistency to make the DCL for the startup be a little bit easier. You see the startup location, and in this particular case, this was the I duplicated this by mistake, but that was the letter in the case, and it would be followed by another one with a different set of. I forgot to change it up here. That was me when I typed it in here. I copy pasted the wrong line, but basically you just do a sync on entry, and it'll sync on the previous entry before it continues, and then as soon as that one was done, it would submit the next one, and off you would go. And you could have done a job queue of 1, but it was just given the way the system was set up originally, it was just easier to do it that way. So that was the application startup procedure, and it set up the group names as you see here. Now that defined the group logical names. It also created an application specific logical name table. And again, I didn't want to go through and have to change everything. It was easier just to stick that in there. So within the group logical name table, there's also a daughter table that was called this. And that's the one that was predefined. And it was just easier just to stick that into the group table, and it got it from there without having to go and just reassign everything else. I mean, I could have gone in and done a change of set LNM to the group LNM, but it was just easier to
And that would
this
have been
way.
a colon equals.
What is,
No, within the same procedure equals is fine.
No, you can't, because it's going to try and translate the prime as a variable. And if you didn't put that in quotes. Anyway.
Oh,
it should have been
you're
a
right. That's
colon
what, yeah,
equals.
it's supposed to be colon equals there. Sorry. So yeah, the other thing that was interesting too, and I removed it because it was confusing as all hell, is there was a Pliny underscore V8OL site, and there was also a V8O site underscore Pliny.
Hey, Dan,
Yes.
the next session.
Oh, okay.
That was quick.
Yeah. Well, I was at the last slide anyway.